I get a lot of comments from students saying how they do not use design patterns in real life that often. So I wanted to demonstrate in one real project how easy it is to use design patterns as well as some other object-oriented principles. This is also something that I was personally struggling with for several years. So I will show you my thought process on how to figure out which design patterns to use and when, and also how to keep your objects from overgrowing and doing way too many things at once. By the way, this video is the part of my PHP Design Patterns course. Link is in the description. So here I have a code that was submitted to a coding interview to one big company, and the source is linked in the description. And I've anonymized the author of this code, hello Fred, and I've also anonymized the company. So the task here was to make a project that will have a few pages, a login page, search of users, so it has to connect to the database and deal with some authentication and a few other things. So in the task it was also mentioned that it's okay to use any technique, algorithm and design patterns that would enrich the end quality of the product. And this is, I think, the hint right there. The interviewer wants to see some advanced coding technique, not just to list whatever is supposed to be listed. So this is an excellent opportunity to shine there. So here in this index.php file that I have, that index.php file is controlling what is happening with this application. It has some bootstrap configuration, and then it routes the traffic based on what is given into the route. It uses this mod rewrite so that URLs are so-called pretty URLs. And we have the home, login and register links here and the search here, which is authenticated. And this basically part of the URL, this results here, is what is being passed to this router, and that is basically what is determining which controller is going to show the data. It's basically the MVC pattern. And by the way, a fun fact, if you use one of these index.php files as the entrance to your application, the starting point of your application, you are already using one design pattern conveniently called the front controller design pattern. And it basically says that there is a single point of entry into the application. So we have already implemented a design pattern. It's up to you to know it and to discuss about it, or to mention it in the product documentation, to say what have you chosen it and what its advantages are. For example, you have a single point where you can reuse a lot of code, a lot of configuration. You have a single point where you can actually stop the application. You can do the validation. You can check against DDoS attacks. And you can basically show the page under construction for every single link without having to think about it, because you have a single entry point, right? So this is something that you can discuss on the interview just to show that you know why are you using that. Now this file basically, it looks clean, it looks fine. It's intended properly mostly, except for this search case, which is just breaking the rule from all the other things. And believe me, people notice that. But however, it's great. It works properly. The sign-in works there. There is no problems with login. We can log into the application, and we can even search for the users, and it works. That's great. That's a good sign already. And this code was written by somebody with 2 or 3 years of experience, the actual coding experience, and that's actually great, because this is something that I was writing when I had 5 years of experience before I really started to learn difficult concepts. So there's a lot of good things, but the response the applicant got was that the code was actually okay, but that he lacks a bit of experience. And that is also my conclusion as well. So I will mostly focus on the possible improvements here. In essence, my opinion is that the candidate understands the object-oriented principles, but the practical implementation is a bit difficult. And I understand that really well, as I mentioned, because I struggled with that for years on how to actually use the object-oriented principles properly in a project. So I thought I will quickly go over the code and look at what could be improved to show my comments, and then we can come back and implement those patterns. So this PHP file, index.php file, it does a lot of things here. And that is the usual behavior. There is some configuration and there is some routing and things like that. However, one thing that I noticed is that there are variables here hanging in the so-called unmanaged scope, or the global scope if you wish. It's not actually global variables, but the scope is undefined. And that is usually considered a bit of bad practice with object-oriented principles. Because one of the advantages of object-oriented approach is that the objects couple their code very tightly. They encapsulate code, so they put it in a capsule, right? In one object, the things that are related one to each other. So when you have things here just handling around like this host and database username and password, for example, in this config init, there is one more included to the config PHP. There are just variables defined, and that could be fine thing, but you have a username here. Now what happens if I here have to connect to the email provider, for example? I will also have the username. So you can easily get some undesired behavior because the variables will just overwrite each other, and you will not get any problem with that because PHP is perfectly fine with that. But it's just a good thing to have because it makes code difficult to debug, to reuse code, and to trace. Now I cannot figure out where this username is coming from. I had to go into this init. There is no username defined here, but then I had to go into config. Oh yes, there it is now. And there are several approaches about this. However, I will get back to the point that was mentioned to the task, and that is to show some advanced features or principles. And one thing that we can do straight away here is basically what we did in the first lesson. We can get a database into the Singleton. We could even use the factory pattern, which could make a different database for us or make one database and configure it for us. That might be a bit over-engineering because we actually don't need that, but a singleton is a very good thing for database because it will make sure that we have only one single connection to the database so that we don't accidentally connect to the database multiple times. We could also do something with these configuration variables here. We can just put that in one object and get it from there. We will come back to this, but the main reason again for why we use the objects, and especially here, is to encapsulate the data that should basically just not lie around all over the place like here. Every value should have its place where it is clearly defined, ideally in an object. Similar here, this code that is parsing some routes and maybe even switching through routes is some case of an router class. It even says here in the to-do that the student has sent on the code review that he was planning on creating a router class. But the fact itself that the candidate actually wrote this to-do here, that he was about to make a router class and make improvements, could be an indication that the candidate is actually lacking some object-oriented thinking or experience, basically. And that is the thing that raises those red flags when you're doing something, because if I would to hire somebody to make me this, it sort of makes no sense to write a to-do here, because making a router class takes exactly the same time as writing this comment here. You can just copy all of this, 2 lines, and make a method in one class called parse route, and the second one, figure out the correct route. So there is no reason why this object is not created. The time frame for this task was, I don't know, about 5 hours or whatever, but it takes like 5 minutes. We'll come back to that and see. But that could be an indication that the candidate is not actually sure how to make this object, that the candidate is lacking a bit of control, because you don't have to make anything specific, but you can make something very, very easy. However, this is now the way it is structured. It's a great opportunity to use actually the factory design pattern that it will give us back the controller that we want to use based on this route. And I mentioned this search, and you might think that it's not important to have it here, but indenting the code is actually very important because it makes code easier to read. Things stand out. When I am about to review someone else's code, I go through it and scroll, and I see that this one is sort of special, and it just draws my attention to figure out why is it special, because it's just doing the same things as the others. And that is easy to fix. A good IDE will actually help you by having a shortcut for this, and it can actually do indenting when you're saving the file. It can do the auto indent of the code, so you don't have to think about it. But it's small details that are actually pretty important when you're communicating with some other programmers, and our code is basically communicating with other programmers, right? It does not communicate with server because server does not care how we write this, which design patterns we use. That is something that our colleagues and our future self care. And one other question that I might ask while I'm still here is why these controllers are being called statically and this user controller is not. The static methods are mostly used when there is a specific reason for that, like in singletons, when we do not want to initialize object in the first place, or we do not want to create more than one object per application cycle. In this example here, it makes little to no sense to use static methods here. First, static methods, by definition, they leak the scope because they are static. They're not related to that object. And because of that and few other things, they're generally not a good object-oriented practice to do. We will talk a bit more about this when we come back, but I see that they all have with home controller to do, except for this user logout. And this also raises another question. Why are these controllers so different? Why couldn't they share some code? Because when I go into user controller, it's not extending anything. In fact, it is also including one of the modules here manually, even though there is, as far as I can see here, the auto loading feature inside the init. So you should not include models if they are auto-included. It sort of doesn't look like polished, like a finished code, that there is still some work to do. And that could be great if you really used a lot of times. But yeah, it's a thing to consider. But this is a good thing to use inheritance because those controllers could share some code. At least, for example, this show the view pages. We don't need basically so many methods doing the same thing. They just have different name and different view. That could be somehow grouped into the parent controller, for example, and just being passed to one general method, which view to show, right? Like a show view, and then you just give it the view if there is any other logic that's not needed there, basically. So you can see that there is a lot of repetition here, and that's one of the dry methods or principles, which stands for do not repeat yourself. So it's helpful to go over some examples to figure out how that can help you. Now, since I'm here, I see that this show results here. On the first look, it doesn't do a lot of things. It just shows a page, a view page with the results if the user is logged in. But if we go into this results here, we can see that they actually go over some list of results from the session. This here is just a check if there are any results or if there is some error message, but the results are coming from session. If I would to open this code actually and to try to search for something, I would be on this results here. Now, this search is actually working. So if I would to write test, there is only one test email, but I don't see any place where these results are being fetched from. They are just being shown here and they are coming from this view, and this view just shows them. In this header there is just form, so these results are somehow magically coming up here. Even though the controller has no business logic in it, it does not control anything, it's just showing some list with results, right? And since this is using the MVC, I assume, I would sort of expect that there is controller logic, a business logic here that's actually doing the search and fetching the results and also controlling if there is an access, because it is checking if the user is logged in by checking the session, but there is no fetching of the results. So when I open this index PHP and I look at this results path, the one that I'm seeing here, right? I would expect in an MVC application that the models are actually working in database and that the controllers are controlling the flow of the data. However, it looks that these results are actually not being fetched from here. They are coming from somewhere else. The second thing that I noticed while we're here is that in these results, the actual view part is reaching out to super globals. So it's going out of its scope. It's going out of the view scope and reaching into something that the controller has no control over. The controller does not set this session any place. It just checks if there is session for the results and if the user is logged in, but the views should not reach out of their scope. The views should only display what is being given to them. And you can say, yes, the sessions are super global and they could be used to pass data around. However, there is one more thing, and that is that sessions are file-based permanent storage system or temporary storage system that the server is using mainly to identify the session, the user who is using that particular session, right? So using sessions to store arrays of data and pass data between pages is, well, at least it's inefficient. Because what is happening here is that the data is already being fetched from the database, which by itself is very slow operation. The databases are slow, it's just the way it is. And then it's being stored into the file on the file system, which is even slower operation. And then they're being retrieved from the file system, which is slower than the database. So it's a bit of a strange concept there. And I understand that the student was doing that in order to pass data from different pages, but things like that should be considered. You should know what the sessions are actually used for and actually how they work. But regardless of their inefficiency, knowing where the data comes from again, is not something that the view portion should do. The view should only display the data, not know about where the data is coming from. You might say that this is nitpicking. What is the difference, right? Well, if somebody comes to help you, like I'm trying here, and you tell me that this is an MVC pattern and project, I know what I should expect. The views showing the data, right? Otherwise, a lot of time is wasted searching now where the data is actually coming from, and I basically need to hack the system to figure out. There is also the first of the solid principles, the single responsibility, which argues that every entity should have a single responsibility on some level. The controllers should control the data flow, and the views should only display it, right? And again, if we look at the web interface, there is nothing indicating that this is doing something other than just displaying this list of results, right? And this is actually where using some framework can teach you a lot about code organization and structure, even if you don't like frameworks, because a lot of people actually hate frameworks, and so did I in my first 5 years of work. But boy, oh boy, there are so many smart people that are contributing to different frameworks. They have solved some serious problems that we can learn from. So even if you don't like to use any open source framework, at least master one, learn one so that you can learn how to make one yourself. Anyway, the only way to find how this works is by going around and hack, and by chance I've seen that this form is actually submitting to the action search and not to the action result. So if I were to open this action search, we can see that that's happening inside the user's controller, inside this find user method. And this find user is creating a new user, it is finding the users, and it is storing them into the results. And here you can see why the session is being used, because there is a redirection from this user's controller into the home controller. Now, all the things that I mentioned before, you can call them a code style or the lack of time or something, and they would be usually something easy to fix. But if I would to hire a candidate, if I would to like it, I would focus on this part here and inquire why was this decision made. And basically the answer on this question and his thought process on this, which actually show me on which level the candidate is with design patterns and object-oriented programming and MVC in general, and maybe even the session itself, how the PHP is working. It could be that the candidate had a great, brilliant idea how this is very good, but I didn't get it. And it's perfectly okay to not know things, because I also googled the hell out of PHP before I start recording any of these videos. But in this particular case, I would personally maybe use this to a bit less complex level and play it safe, and maybe even say that I didn't quite understood some concept very well. So I tried something, I tried to learn something in the process. But I hope that you see why this is confusing and difficult to follow and debug. It took me quite some time to figure out where the data is actually coming from. And this application has 10 files. Imagine when it starts growing with thousands of files, how would you find things if you're not following some of the conventions or some of the principles? And again, this would be a sort of first red flag about the code design of the application. And I think that the application is applying actually for a junior position, so it's okay to pinpoint and show why things are better to do some other way, and that's perfectly fine. But I would definitely investigate this a bit more and figure out if this code is something that he written or maybe found on the internet, why was he thinking like that, what's the thought process about it, what are some advantages and disadvantages, etc. Now this user controller here, it is actually behaving like a proper controller. It has some business logic to it. There are some things that are happening, some logic, right? However, there is this to-do saying to move validation to validation class. I personally would not write it there, at least not for an interview task, because it could show the, I don't know, maybe a lack, the laziness, or maybe a lack of control, which I believe it's in this case. Because, I mean, if the code is decoupled enough, it takes less time to move these methods from users, because this validation is referring to the user, where the user is validating data. It takes less time to move this validation process from the user to a new class than it takes to write this comment. Maybe I would perhaps even write why this validation is here with the user, and the reason to do that is because the candidate is actually checking if the user is registered here, if the user is already in the database. So I would write on that why instead of writing a to-do that something needs to be moved to another file, because moving something takes very, very little time, as I will show you later. And again, I understand that things are here from the best intention. Maybe there was no time, but yeah, I mean, people who are looking at this application know exactly why it is here. you can write that you need to make a completely new validation, or that you would do something more that you didn't have time, but to move something to some other place, yeah, it's a bit thing. So here the validation is checking if the user exists, right? And that may be a reason why this have to be inside the user. But to check if email is valid, that actually doesn't have to be here. And I mentioned that in the technical depth video, you can deliberately make a workaround that takes less time now and then postpone the actual work as a technical depth. However, deliberately writing a code on the wrong place is not a technical depth. It's a lack of control in this case, I believe. And it's the same with the comment here above in the user on the line 37, where there should be a redirection of logged in user. It's one line to redirect the user. And login, I mean, there is a method here, so it's right below. So you just call it either here or in the controller or whatever your thought process is. And by the way, while I'm here, the SQL queries, the commands are actually pretty much always written in capital. So it would be something like select and from in capital, the users and other variables would be small letters, but commands are unwritten convention written in capital. And here I notice a bit about inconsistency, that the parameters are being passed into the method, which is great, which is one way of doing it, especially for login, that's fine. But here above, we can see that the save user is actually using the data that's being passed into the user, which is again great, one way of doing it. However, here in the create user, we see that the user is actually reaching into super globals again and getting the post variables here, the email name and the password. And that you could call it okay because you have to get them somehow, somewhere, right? But it's not ideal because someone could change the form names and variables, and then your models are depending on that, your actual classes are depending on that. Or maybe someone would group all the user variables into one another level here, like user, like this, and put all these fields here, and then you would have to hunt around in all your models to change the model. But you can argue that it's okay because it's here in the create user, it's sort of centralized or contained into one place. But I also noticed that here inside this find user, this very method of finding user is actually reaching out into super globals again and getting this search parameter. And this is definitely not a good thing. There is no need for them. You can just pass this search term here into find users, because that way you can test this method or maybe reuse this method on some other place, somewhere in administration. You could reuse this method in some cron task, which should find some user and send an email and do something automatically into that. So you will not necessarily always get the post, or you could use the get, or not even get the parameter by super globals at all. And then you cannot use this method at all. You are tightly tying this entire method of finding user, which sounds very important. You are tightly connecting it with the super globals of post. What if you change it to get? You will not remember that it is post here, or some place you need to have it in a get, like people would share the links, and in administration you might use the post, etc. And also using the pagination and sorting would be a huge pain in the back, because you're tightly coupling this to post here. And usually a form that is searching would be changed to use the get parameter actually, because you are getting the data from the server and database, right? If you think about it, you're not posting something new into the database. There is no new information being sent to the server into the database, so you would not post the search parameter. So if you were to change it, you would also have to change the model as well, and that's very difficult, almost impossible to follow. That is something that could easily be done in the controller. And we could complicate this and discuss this as much as we wish about small details and things, but let's go over the code and implement a few design patterns and other object-oriented principles. So let's go back to the index file at the very beginning. And the best thing you can do is to actually clone this source, to get this source, and then open it in a text editor and follow about, and maybe pause the video and try to figure out yourself how would you do that. But if you are too lazy to code, you can just pause the video when I'm about to write a code and just think about, or maybe use a pen and paper to sketch down a solution on some of the problems and some of the design patterns. Because remember, watching is understanding, but actually doing is learning. That's how we learn, by doing things. And the first thing that we mentioned was this database, this singleton thing that we can use to make the database a singleton. However, since we've done that in the very first lesson, I figured that we could maybe make this config a singleton, so that I can show you how you can initialize these variables inside the singleton to have them globally available, because you can argue that basically a configuration class or object could be a singleton. It should be only one object that should not be initialized multiple times, and it should have only one value. So let's quickly make one folder class that I will just put some files or the new classes in, and I can just make one new file called config. Now, one great tip that you can use when you're about to create new objects or when you're about to refactor existing functionality, like I'm doing right now, is to make one index.php file that's isolated. It doesn't have to be index.php, where you can include only one object that you are about to work with, and that will give you a very good control of how isolated your object is, how much it depends on other objects, and how much you can use it independently or reuse it later, which will basically avoid this way of using this post search. If I would to include these users in another file, it will not work because it will expect to have this search method here. So that's why in this index.php file, we can just include our future config file or any other file, and we can test here how it's behaving. For now, let's make the config class first. We'll just make a new class called config, right? That will be a singleton, which means that it should be a final class, right? Because it should not be extended. Now, the singletons, as we remember from the very first lessons, have a few methods that should be overwritten, like this clone. It should basically be overwritten as a private, because we don't want to do anything when somebody tries to clone our objects. And the same goes for wake. And we could even use this struct, which should basically remove our reference, which should be here made as a private static reference or instance, whatever you call it, which will be a null in the beginning. Now we will need one private method, which can also be a static, named init, and this is where we are going to trigger the initialization of this project, of this object, sorry. It is something similar that we have with the database. There we have the get instance, because we were actually interested into getting the instance. With the config, we just want to get the values from the config object. We don't want to get the actual instance of the config object, because we don't want to do anything with it. It should be very simple, and in this init, we are basically going to check if there is instance, or if it is a null. So that should be self instance, right? If it's null, then we are going to initialize it, and we could make one new config, or we could even use the new self keyword that will actually use this config as a keyword. So you don't have to, if you change the config name, maybe to configuration or something, you don't have to change the code here. And then it is going to actually return the self instance. And this is basically the singleton part, all the logic that is making our instance and making sure that there is only one instance of this class or this object, right? And then we are going to use one public static function that could be named getValue, for example, where we are going to ask for the value itself that is going to be returned, the one from the config. So what we are doing now is we are moving these parameters somewhere here inside of this config class, and we will see why that is a good thing, how we can even improve on that. But for now, we are basically going to return some values, right? And that should be a self, we don't have anything. So let's just make something with values, for example, because I'm that creative. And we are going to get one key from there. And we need to store these values, right? We have the singleton, but we don't have any values in them. Now we can put the values here. We can also have it as a null because it doesn't matter. So we could initialize values somewhere here in the init or after that. However, since we have the constructor and we have not made it private yet, let's make a constructor private and let's actually use it, because why not? We have it there. And this constructor could actually get all these values and set them inside our self values now. So now the singletons will contain all these configurations, let's call it config, and let's put everything here inside an array, which will have the keys. For example, the host will be the local host, and then this database username will be things that we are going to put in our configuration array. For now, it's an array. It could be a multi-level array. It could be something much more fancy that we want to work with. And also, the most importantly, this part could be some other include file. Because the way it is set up now here in this config.php, There is no way to figure out if this is my machine, if this is a live server, because the moment you upload this code to the live server, it will basically not have the empty password here, or maybe not the same username, maybe not the same database name at all. So you don't want to upload one config that I cannot use on my machine and it cannot run on the live machine. It will only work on my machine. That's this very difficult concept to have, a very difficult application. So this config can actually require and include the proper file, or maybe read this configuration from some XML file, or maybe the .env file, which is more common way of retrieving the configuration variables. And then every developer on every machine basically will have their own .env file and have the proper configuration there. So we don't have to think about some of those configurations here. But for now, it's a good idea to centralize it here, because then we can just use our config in the rest of our application. And this should be pretty much it. However, one thing that is missing is actually initialization of this instance. We are not calling the init any other place. We could call it in a constructor, but we could also call it here inside the get value. Because even though we don't need our instance at all, we basically just want to initialize it once so that it goes through the constructor and that it stores itself into the instance. And then we can also get these values. We can even check if these values have any, if this keys has any values by just providing an empty string if it's not found using this null coalescent parameter here, which will just run is set on this values key and give us the empty if it's not set. Now let's test this. So now let's test our config file by calling it from this newly created index, the test index PHP file, if you will. So we can just call require once the config PHP. And then I could just dump, let's use var dump, because why not, the config get values. And let's use one key like db, which should be a name of the database. Now I can even run this file from the console. I don't even have to open the browser, and I can see that it's not working because there is something with the destruct. So let's just remove this destruct for now, and let's just try again. And we can see that we actually get the code review, which is actually the database value or the db value here. Now, if I would to dump in this construct just the text that we are constructing, just to test if this is Singleton, if I would to get another value, which could be a named host, right? So if I would to run this again, we can see that we are constructing and we are getting two values, but only one constructor, which means that this is actually Singleton, and getting multiple values will not create this object multiple times. And you see how easy it is to test here. I can just write several configuration parameters and just see if our class is behaving properly, which I would put some fake value here. I can just hit run from here and it will give me the empty string as expected. Now this is a very powerful way of writing your code and constructing your code, because you're isolating the code. You're not using super globals here. You're thinking in the good, clean code, and you can just run it and very easily test it. You don't have to run any testing framework. You can just run this file by using the php.x and then the file path from the console. And there you have it. We have implemented one of the design patterns, which is a singleton. Now it's just to implement this class and replace or refactor this use of unscoped variables so that they can use the actual config class here, because we know that it's working as expected. But the next thing that we talked about is moving this database into a singleton. And I would actually like it that you do it as your homework, because I've shown you how. I've shown the usage of singletons into the very first lessons. So it should be easy. If you find it difficult, go back to the source code, look at this code, but try as much as you can to do it on your own, because it will help you understand what is going on by actually struggling with the code. So we already have implemented one design patterns. Two actually if you count the front controller, and three if you write the MVC, but that needs to be properly implemented. So no messing around with who does what. But the next thing is routing. And here we could do this routing. We can refactor it as simple as we want, as simple as one object that has two methods. One would be parsing this route, and the second method would be determining the correct controller. But since we know better, we know design patterns now, right? we can actually use the factory pattern here that will create the appropriate controller for us. If you remember, the purpose of the factory pattern is to make us a fitting object that will be based on some conditions and perhaps even configure that object for us, because in reality this PHP file does not really care about which controller should be called. That is for factory to determine. It is just there to run the controller that's being used in the route, right? And again, here it's also useful to use some frameworks just to get familiar with how they have solved it and try to simulate something similar that's already been done. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? So let's make one router.php class here. So we can just have a class router, and it will have one method like public function parse route, which we are going to pass from our side, from our controller, right? And a good reason to have it as a separate object and also have this method here is because a route could be a pretty URL, right, like it is here in this example, but it could be that on some servers or some PCs, it's not working with this pretty URLs. It could be that we have to use something like index.php and then say that the controller or the route or whatever should be search like this, because our servers, for whatever reason, cannot support the mode rewrite. So we want to support multiple ways of using our application. Maybe the administration does not need the pretty URL as we had it, because then this could be completely dynamic, or it could be fetched from database, it could be into some other place, you could react to some search engines. There are a lot of things that you could do once you have the route flexible. So that's why it's a good thing to have one single place of handling the route. Even if it's doing a very simple thing, like in this case, it can just do what it was doing here in this index file. And here, instead of this request, we are going to parse this route that we are going to give it. And then it can just return the route. And this, of course, is not actually the route itself. This is route, but you can fix that on your own. For now, let's see if this is actually working, but by using our test index.php file. Again, we are just going to comment this one here, and I'm going to include our newly created router.php. Then I'm going to make one router object from new router, right? And here is what we would do inside of our regular controller. We would pass it this request URI. So it will be route parse route, this URI. However, since this is a test and we are not actually running it from the browser at all, we can just comment this one and make a similar case where we are actually simulating what we want. So we can say this would be a search and see how this one runs. And apart from this error, which says that I am not giving it the, the route that it should parse, right? Let's try that again. It doesn't return anything because we are not actually dumping anything. So the route here will be actually returned, and we can just var dump the route. Let's try again. And we can see that it gets us the first portion, which is empty, and the second one is search, which is for whatever reason like that. But if we would to put the result and try this one, we can see that, yeah, it's you see now that this array has one value, and that's because it's splitting by this back line, and that's an excellent way of testing something. It probably works fine in the browser, so I will just continue with this. But we can see that this result is being returned as well as the login. So we don't have to open the browser and type manually all the URLs. We can just have all our tests here and see if this is actually returning what it's supposed to do. We can see that it's returning the user, the logout, for example. If our route changes, we should get now array with 3 values, which is great, which means that we are parsing the route correctly and our router is basically working. So it took like 5 minutes to create a very simple class, which is basically the same time it takes you to create this to-do. So be careful what you write in to-dos and what you leave for later. Now, as mentioned, we can go a bit advanced and we can actually create one controller factory, which will create a good controller for us. So if I were to make one file, controller factory, it will going to have some methods basically that will just make our controller. So we can just call it make, right? And it will basically go over this switch case here, and it will just return the correct controller. So we can just copy this switch and start with that, and then we are, instead of just calling this show property or this show login form, we can just return the proper controller, right? So we can either return from here the new controller, And of course, this would require you to change the controller to not be a static method, because we talked about why we don't need that. And there is also one thing about using the factory. It might not work perfectly in this case because it will not return the method back. So the method would actually need to be figured out here from the router. The router could return the method that the controller should run. You can modify the factory so that it returns even more complex object. We can even modify the controllers so that they always have one method to run, and we can do that later. But for now, let's return the new controller just to use the factory. So you can see now that we are returning the same home controller, which means that we can just move this login part above, and we don't even have to think about this. We can have this result here as well, and the register here as well, because they're all returning the home controller. So we don't need this. And all these four are returning the user controller with the database handle. And the database handle is something that we need to provide here inside the make, the same way as we are going to provide the route that the router will make for us, right? So this user controller will then have this database handle, which will be returned when somebody calls one of these routes. This is an excellent example of do not repeat yourself or dry principles that we can use here. And the default could return whatever, either a view or it should return some 404 controller in this case. And again, we remove these statics because they are similar to global functions, and that's not what we want to have in our object-oriented project, because again, it breaks encapsulation of data, and it also makes the object not reliable. You are changing the state potentially using the static methods, but you don't know which object are you referring to. You're using the class. Static methods are the classes properties, the classes functionality, that you are using, and that's sort of not a object's thing to do. So we don't want to break encapsulation. We want to have everything in our controller, in our object, whichever it is, everything encapsulated in one place. And now again, the method could not be returned from this factory. And you can say that this is a reason why this could be an over-engineering. But since we returned all controllers now, basically the home or the user controller based on all these routes, let's do a quick test here inside of our class index. We can just have a new controller factory, and let's call the make on it. And here we could basically send in the route that our router are giving us back from, say, this results route. So we would need to pass in the route, and we will need to pass in the database. We don't have the database in our index PHP, which indicates that this controller factory is dependent on the database, and that's something that you should decide. Do you need that dependency or not? We need it in this case. However, since in our make we are only passing in the database to the user, we don't basically even care if it's doing something. It's just being assigned there. So we can just send in new fake, let's say, standard class, which is undefined class that PHP has, or the standard type class which PHP has as a helper. Let's just run this to see what will break. And the controller factory is not found, and that's because I didn't include it. So let me include that one, run it again to see. And we can see that it's not working properly because it's not getting the route correctly. And I suspect that it's because we have this view 404 here in the include. So the PHP is trying to include it even if we are not going into this case. And that's one thing to consider. I even didn't know that that is what PHP does, but apparently it does. If I were to remove this default case here, these breaks are never actually reached because we have the return here, so we could remove them as well. If I were to try to run it again, it's finished, and that's because we are not getting anything back. So let's say that we are here expecting a controller, and let's just dump this controller to see what it contains. With a bit of luck, it's null, and that's because the route is not correct. Let's see what the route has to say. It is saying that there are results, which should be, it's result, so it should be results. And that's great. Our route is basically working as expected. So the results here should give us back a home controller, which is not found. And that is something that our factory is trying to make here. If I were to remove this route and include the home controller, which will be from controllers and the home controller PHP, third line. And now we have the home controller return. So this controller is already pre-configured and made object for us from our controller factory. So we don't have to think which controller we should run. The route which the router is providing and the controller factory are determining that for us. Basically, controller factory is determining that for us based on this route. It is figuring out which controller should be returned and how it should be configured. Some need database, some don't need database, etc. So it will make all those decisions for us so that we can just run something here in this PHP. So this should be now all removed and be replaced with what we have tested and made here into this index PHP. Now the problem about executing the proper function, the proper method from the controller could be fixed by making this by using the inheritance, and I will come back to this later, but for now I can just implement the one controller that we are about to make here inside this class folder, and it will be called controller, right? And here we can make one public method called execute, which will get the method in, and it will basically execute that method dynamically. It will of course check if the method exists on itself, and it will check the method. If it does exist, it will just execute it. If not, it could execute the 404 method. But this will basically do things in such a way that we know exactly which method to execute. And I will come back to this later so that we can see how it's working. But before I forget, now that we have this factory controller, if you really want this job, you could even combine the dependency injection here, because why not? We have the factory, we have the router. The factory is basically depending on this result from the router. And we don't have to call this one here, because otherwise we would always have to call this here, even if we would to use this factory in some other places. So that's something that we can actually inject into the factory. So instead of providing the route here, we could provide the actual router, right? Because remember, the dependency injection in this case allows us to change this router for something else, the similar way that we have this standard class. You see how easy it is to test. We can provide whatever and the code will not care because it's not executing in this case. But we could make another router that will work with XML files, that will work with database that we talked about, etc., the pretty URLs. So instead of giving the route results to this make method, because route results are not now typed, we don't know what the route results is. If we change the result from router, the factory will break basically because it doesn't know what it is. It's assuming that it's an array. But if we would to make one method here, call public function make from router, for example, we could actually say that here we want the router provided. And that means that we cannot provide any array or anything. It has to be this router that we've just made. And similar thing could be for the database, but here we can actually just call this make, and we can just reuse that. And we can say that the router needs to parse the route and it needs to get it back. Now, hopefully you notice that this parse route requires a parameter, and that is because we are providing it here. To fix that, we can actually give this URI to the router here when we are creating it. So we can just move this from here and give it to the router, and then provide the router to the make from router class. I hope you're following this because it's a very cool concept. Now we have a router, right? That is by just being initialized, we are giving it the URI, the correct path that it should do. So here inside the constructor, we want to set the correct URI, whatever it's called, the entire path or the URL or whatever you give it. So we can just set this URI to whatever we give it to URI. And we can even overwrite it here with the route, but we can say that it's not needed anymore. We can say that it's empty by default. So if it's not empty, then we are going to overwrite this URI with the route. Otherwise, we are going to use it as it is. With a bit of luck, this should work, or at least show us what the error is. What have I forgotten? And it's complaining about the interface, and that's because this is not actually an interface. The home controller should extend the controller, not the interface. Let's see what the error is now. The class controller is not found. It's because I am not including it here. And now there are no controllers given back. And let's see why is that. What this make from router is not actually returning anything. It should return whatever the make is doing, and bingo, we have the home controller now directly from the router. So it took only a few minutes to implement the dependency injection and make this even more fancy, even more advanced, because if you remember from the task description for the task requirements, there was emphasis on the using design patterns and using a bit more advanced coding principles, and you can argue that this is a good approach because we have separated the controller from the controller factory, from the router, and we have a bit more robust code that could be easily tested from one independent class. It could have different ways of testing, it could work in different ways, it's much more flexible, it's not depending on anything, the router is not depending on anything, it's just doing what it's supposed to do, it's using the single responsibility principle. So we have covered at least 3 or 4 or 5 design patterns: Singleton, factory, dependency injection, MVC if you like, the front controller. And if you continue developing this way with the separate files and learn at least these patterns that we talked about to a level that you are comfortable to talk about them with some other developer, with some senior, with some CTO, why you use them, what are their advantages, what are similarities, why do they do a similar job, what are their disadvantages, etc. I believe that you're in a pretty good shape of landing this job actually, of making it through this interview. Now this took some time because I'm trying to explain while I'm making. However, we are still at the point 2 of our comment, so let's go back to this controller and talk a bit about inheritance. Why have we done what we have done here? And we can see that there are things that we can basically do. We could, as we talked, we could remove all of these and have one show method that's inside the main controller, right? Which will just show the view file name, whatever you call it, however you want to design that. And then we can just include that file here and remove all these methods from here and remove everything from the other controller, the user controller, that's not pretty much doing anything. Luckily here everything is being used, but we at least move something to the main controller because that way we're using some of the benefits of inheritance, which are things that the children of the parent will inherit, right? Thus the name. So they will preferably share some common functionality, like the example of show results, of the execute or run or whatever you call it, or the show method that we already implemented here. And being one of the principles of object-oriented programming, something that you could be talking with the CTO or somebody the senior on the technical interview once you've shown them this code, which means that we can now do a lot of things here that are common inside this controller, right? Like the database handling, for example, it could be done here inside of the main controller, or we could move a bit more functionality here, some view functionality. So we are reusing our code basically, and we are also keeping this controller model more robust when we make new controllers, when we add more functionality. So if you're not familiar with it, make sure that you understand what inheritance is and what are its benefits in some real-life project. Now, if you remember, inside of our user controller, we have this comment here that says that the validation should be moved to a new class, right? And this could be done as simple as making one validation.php file where we are going to have a new class called validation, right? Where we are going to move some of the mentioned validation functionality. Let's say validate email and validate password. And again, we can test that from here. I will comment this code because we don't need it anymore. And we can just require once validation and make a new validation object, right? Then we can just test if the validation of email, for example, this should be public, is working correctly. So I can write some email test at test.com and see what it gives us. Forgot to close this parenthesis here. It will give us the true for this email, but if I would to run some fake email, it will give us false for our fake email. And it's very easy to test because you can write just a bunch of tests here and see if they all return what they're supposed to do. And then we can just throw in this validation as a dependency injection back into the user class here. So instead of doing this manual, we are just going to do validation, and then we can just paste in the validation here, again using the dependency injection, and this took less than 3 minutes to make a separate entity for validation, which is again the same time it took to write this comment that validation should be moved. On top of that, our code is now a bit more organized because we have validation. You immediately know where the validation is being done. I don't have to think or remember that it's in one of the models. Right now we have one model, but when we get 10 or 20, we sort of need to remember where the validation is happening. And if we would to reuse this validation some other places to add some validation of IP address or the address or whatever, it's much easier to follow and to extend and to reuse this code. And if you really want to be fancy with the validation and complicate it even more, check out my YouTube video describing the open-close principles. I will have the link into the resources and description. And there we actually split this validation in the entire model, allowing us to have new rules without changing this validation class at all here by using the open-closed principles. Now we can complicate this as much as we want, but one thing that I want to mention also is that here inside this README file, as you notice, there is a login information, and that's basically what the applicant has sent me. Something along these lines. I've changed it, of course, but there is a huge opportunity that's missed here, and that is communicating everything that we did. So you could write a summary of the application here. Which technologies have you used? Which design patterns? Which principles have you used? Do you have some comments that could be improved? Do you have some questions that you might have? Do you have some notes about something that you're not sure about? Do you have some thoughts about why have you made the validation the way that you've done it? Why have you made the users the way that you've done? There is a lot of things that you could communicate here inside of this README instead of just saying this is the way to run the application, good luck. You can tell so much by communicating actually here, because what you're doing when you're sending this code for a review with some seniors, you're basically fishing and hoping that they will just hook into something, get enough interest from them into your code, into your capabilities, so that you can basically be invited into the technical interview, right? To get the job. That's the point of this project. It's not about having the perfect code or running the perfectly. You want to show your skills, but of course, keep the code base in the best shape that you can. And final thing before we wrap out, I mentioned the usage of the sessions here in the index, in this main index, inside of this results PHP file again. So these sessions being listed here, these results being listed from the sessions here, this is relatively easy to fix by just moving either this view from this home results from here inside the actual place where the search is being done, here inside the find user. So instead of redirecting, we could just show the results, here. And here we could check if the user is logged in or not, so that we have one place of control. We could even check if user is logged in inside of our main controller, right? Before we are actually writing or calling this execute on this or any of those methods. We could do this programmatically. We could now tweak this a lot more. And again, using sessions could be fine in this example here, because we have a small application, small thing, but it's generally a not that advised tactic, because it is unnecessary retrieving data from the database, again, which is already a slow operation, and then storing and reading them from the sessions, which actually works with files, which just makes things even slower. So when you have hundreds or thousands of results or pagination or things like that, you will struggle a lot. And also, it is not a good thing to do if you want to get a job in a serious company on a serious project. Now, it would be great to have this view here inside of the home controller, for example, the user controller, instead of just including the view PHP. It would be great if there is a view model that will encapsulate all that's happening with these variables here. And that is something that you can make as simple as the router, right? There is just few methods that are needed, nothing more complex, but that is actually something that could be left as a technical debt, because that is something that requires time. And if you do it intentionally, then it's okay. It's nothing wrong to do that. So before we summarize what we did in this entire video, let me just remind you that this video is actually a part of the course about PHP design patterns in real life, where we talk about the practical application of design patterns. So if you want to learn more about design patterns, check out my course with the link in the description. The price is still discounted, as this course is still in the making. and it might just be the thing that you're missing with mastering the advanced object-oriented programming. So to summarize, we refactored a configuration and a database into singletons, something that we did with this config file here, and database is something that you're going to do for the homework, right? And now we have a single source of truth for this configuration and for the database as well. And we have also encapsulated this data, this configuration parameters here, so they are not leaking all over the place. We don't have to remember what they are. We can just get them from our configuration class, right? We also used a separated index, which is here to force us to make our models use the single responsibility principles and to keep our models basically untangled from the rest of the application. Meaning our config now and router and database and factory, they're all very isolated from the entire application, from this project, and each does only the things that it's supposed to do. It's a very easy way to think what is belonging into which file. And if you learn only one thing from this video, I would like it to be this, to have this approach as to how you create your object, because it can help you tremendously keeping the object small and focused. At least that's something that helps me when I'm making new objects or refactoring some existing. And we can also test them easily, and perhaps even automatically. We could just run a cron job that will just show the results from this. Whenever we do some changes into the router, for example, we can just go inside our config class, for example, and change whatever we need to change. We still know that it should work from this class when we uncomment this. It should just give us the correct result, or the router, or the factory, or whatever. It's very, very easy to test because we've already written the tests here, right? We can also see different scenarios if they are giving the correct values for the wrong emails, etc. We also use the factory design pattern here that will actually make us and configure the controllers for us. It will give us the correct controller based on some route or based on some other business logic that should be applied here. So that way we don't have to worry what is the correct object. We can just call it, and the factory will figure that for us. We then use the dependency injection to have objects use another objects. Here in this make from router, right, we are injecting the entire router, and no matter which kind of router or where the data is coming from, we know that this parse route should return always the same result, and as long as it does that, our factory will work fine, our application will work fine. So here in the class we can just do some very easy if-else about the router, whereas about the factory here, and we can just either make from one router or the other router or some third router, some fake router, whatever we need. We can just do it very easily because we know which router we are controlling, right? Which router we are giving back. It could be that we have a factory around the router that is giving this router via dependency injection to the another factory. So you see how design patterns work together. But this dependency injection means that instead of our objects making dependencies or depending on superglobals like we had in the beginning on this user, where it's using the superglobals in the post, or sometimes it's making its own values. In this case, it is using the dependency injection, which is great at least. So instead of objects making those dependencies themselves, like here, we are going to provide those dependencies like here. We're going to make them and just give them to our objects. We have also removed the session as storage for large data, as this is inefficient as we talked about, and we have refactored users by removing the validation, right? We've made one validation class which will only do a validation because that's a single responsibility for it. We don't have to worry about the user stuff in our validation and vice versa. And of course, we can also complicate this project way more and way more, but if someone would to hand me this source and more importantly could be able to discuss with me all the principles, design patterns and solutions implemented here, why are they good and also what are their limitations, I would be pretty happy with the candidate. I'm sorry, Fred, if I am being harsh from time to time, but I really hope that there is something useful here that could be learned from this example. Personally, I wish that somebody would sit down with me and tell me all those things when I was receiving the response that I needed more experience, because these are exactly the same thing that I was struggling with. What I would love from you guys now is that you critique my code in the comments. What did I wrote wrong? What was over-engineer, what could be improved, what are some alternatives and drawbacks of the things that I've implemented. Because remember, no code is perfect, even if I write it, right? But as long it can be easily changed, that we are on a pretty good track here. If you want some of your code to be reviewed, please join our Facebook or Discord group and just reach out to me with your source. And here is a joke for you.